I have to start off by saying this is not exactly marketing material. In fact, it'll probably convince a number of you that you don't want to and probably shouldn't take your team through my capacity intensive. Because if you do, you'll get your business into predictable success, but it's not where you want to be. Why? Because the number one reason that founders who want to be in that peak growth stage, predictable success, the number one reason has nothing to do with the value of their product, the size of their market, or even with their capacity as a leader. Instead, the number one reason that they pull back on the reins is that they have the wrong people serving on their leadership team, and they're just not willing to make the necessary changes to change that. Now, this is what happened to John. You see, John had built an incredible business, and Gary had been there since day one. John was your classic entrepreneur. He left a promising career at a prominent tech company in the Valley to try out his hand at doing his own thing. He'd grown tired of all the bureaucracy and all the mind-numbing meetings, and he knew that there was a way that he could do something remarkable. But he also knew he couldn't do it alone. And that's why he recruited Gary to jump ship and join him. He and Gary had known each other since college. Their careers had followed different paths, with John going into business development while Gary was going into software development. Now together, they were a force to be reckoned with. The relationship was symbiotic, to put it mildly. They just got each other. John would come up with some crazy idea or make some outlandish promise to a client, and somehow Gary would make it happen. They worked 100+ hour weeks together, and they loved it. Every week was a race across the finish line, and somehow every week they made it. Every time it mattered, they pulled it off. And the business grew. As it did, John and Gary increasingly took on more managerial roles. Their 5-person startup was now a 50-person firm with offices both in San Jose and in New York. John hired a few outside sales reps so he could focus on new ideas and big client relationships, and his role took on an increasingly strategic perspective. Gary, he also found himself managing more people, but he didn't take to it quite as well as John did. For Gary, waiting on others who were always slower was agony. He constantly felt caught between John on one side pulling him forward and the rest of the team dragging him behind. He could be short with those who didn't keep up, and he had a nasty habit of jumping in to fix everything himself if a project got behind. He wouldn't admit it, but the stress was really building up. Still, John and Gary's relationship was great. That is until one leadership team meeting. You see, the New York office was struggling. They'd dropped the ball on a few big projects recently, and the leadership team was trying to figure out what had gone wrong. And that's when John noticed that Gary wasn't there. Well, he was physically there, but John could tell from Gary that Gary's mind was somewhere else. And Gary had always hated meetings. And he did his very best work on his own and tried to get out of every meeting he could. But here and now, John needed Gary. The New York office actually reported to Gary, but for some reason, he just didn't care to engage here and now in the meeting. For whatever reason, this time in particular, John recognized how big a problem it was. It wasn't the first time Gary wasn't paying attention. In fact, over the last couple of months, Gary had missed several important issues brought up in meetings. He seemed to increasingly be going against the grain of the rest of the company. Now, after a meeting, John took a moment to think about it. He needed Gary to step up. He needed him to be better in meetings. He needed him to engage. He needed him to be more strategic. What he needed Gary to lead. But he also knew that Gary wasn't that kind of leader. So John talked to Gary about it one evening over a cup of beers, and the two agreed, yeah, change is needed. John was going to try and dial back some of the new ideas to give Gary space, and Gary was going to start working on contributing more strategically in meetings. He was also going to focus on growing as a leader. But what happened? As is normally the case, nothing changed. Gary continued to struggle. The New York office continued to flounder, and John found himself faced with an incredibly difficult decision. One of them had to go. Either the New York office or Gary. Now, John knew the right business decision was to move Gary out of his role or maybe even out of the company, but he just couldn't do it. Gary had given too much. He was like a brother to John. Gary was probably responsible for the majority of the success that the company had achieved so far. Without him, John never would have gotten the business off of the ground, let alone to the success that he'd achieved today. John lost a lot of sleep trying to decide whether or not he should move Gary out or what to do. And in the end, he owed too much to Gary to just cut him off. So John closed down the New York office, and he and Gary focused their team on providing incredible customer service out of their San Jose office. John knew in his heart that it was the right decision, but it cost him dearly. Before the New York office failed, the sky was the limit. There was nothing that the two of them couldn't do. But now, today, John knows it's not true. They won't be opening new offices around the globe. They won't be the next billion-dollar IPO. But honestly, he doesn't regret it for a moment. Gary is now back in his sweet spot. They love working together, and the two of them take family vacations together to San Diego in the summer and Salt Lake City in the winter every single year. Now, in the next video, I want to break down this incredibly common story, and I want to help you to navigate some of these incredibly difficult decisions when you find yourself in John's position.